Hi, I'm Jim Clark, Visual Arts Manager here at Hopkins Center for the Arts. Today we're speaking with Toni Gallo about her exhibition, Continuous Thread, Unravelling Insight, on view in the first floor lobby gallery through September 9th, 2023. Toni, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for sharing your work with our community. Can you tell us how you describe what you do as an artist?
Well, first, there's the mysterious part of making work. Comes from, there's something that compels me to do it. It's not something I can identify because it honestly doesn't make sense to make art. Then now I've evolved into the process of using it. It's not that I chose to, it just sort of happened that it's become kind of a meditation. Not even kind of, it is a meditation. While I'm making and painting and deciding, I notice when I'm present and when I'm not, which is the practice of meditation, is noticing when you're adding from past, future projection, and when you're kind of in that free space where you feel a sort of peace, harmony. And so I make decisions about aesthetically what's interesting to me, but the process of how it unfolds, how the landscapes unfold, how I add figures or composition choices is more successful when I'm present.
Mm-hmm. Do you identify primarily as a painter? I mean,
yes.
It would seem that way. And
yes.
Have you always been a painter?
When I reflect back at my life and making work, I would say yes, 100% painter.
Mm-hmm. And when you say that more recently it's become a meditative practice, was that merging it with a practice of meditation outside of painting, and you had a meditative practice and a painting practice, and then those two converged?
So two things. So I always made work.
Yeah.
I always made art since I was little. And some of it was terrible. And for my young adult life, it felt a little stressful, but I always did it. That's where that mystery comes into place, where it's like, I don't know why I do it, because it hasn't always necessarily felt great, or like the product hasn't been great, but I've just always done it.
Sure.
After I started meditation and awareness practices on a regular basis, I realized when I was painting one day, I was like up doing some detail work, and you like sit back or step back, and I took a huge breath. It was like, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. Because my meditation is a breath-focused meditation, it became really evident that the stress and anxiety I had when making art was because I wasn't breathing. I wasn't present. So the work was based on ideas. Some of them were great ideas, and my technical skills brought me there, and that's probably why I kept doing the work. But once I realized that if I was present, something different happened in the work, more freedom, more sincerity, a deeper vibration and connection, then everything really has changed. And that was like from a show I had at Sioux Visual Arts Center based on a grant I got. When I realized this, I wrote a grant about pairing the two. And since then, I felt really excited and grew super grateful to have a practice that like has the bonus of this thing I can share that vibrates that same thing.
And it was kind of an aha moment in the process of working that came about. And how long ago was this? I mean, how long has it been since you've achieved this synthesis of meditative practice and painting practice?
It was like 2018.
So fairly recently.
Yeah.
Did that part of your art making practice, was that helpful through the pandemic period? or did you notice any difference? Like some artists found it hyper productive. They could really focus. Others were found it almost impossible to do any work.
I found that since this, I could work all day. I feel like I go through blocks and make terrible stuff and get frustrated and forget how to paint, but more than that, like I can go in and work in some manner in a creative way all day, every day. And during the pandemic, I remember starting, well, also there's this freedom in it. So if I notice I'm getting stuck doing the same thing over and over again, I make up a practice to get me out of my own way and see what happens. So if I'm blocked or stuck, like happens to everybody and everything they do, you rely on something, you get attached to it, and then it causes friction, and you're like, and then I notice it, and I'm like, okay, I do something totally different, and it usually is super amazing and gives me a whole new direction. But during the pandemic, I started sewing hand sewing like a huge tapestry. Of course, still not done, but so that was totally different and exciting, and it just gave me something to, while being in a house with my 2 kids and husband, something to do that I could do while interacting, and also just was like this, I'm going to do this thing, and just started it. I'm really excited about it. I think it has future potential too. It'll be fun when it's done someday.
For sure. And does that, and I'll reduce it to rut busting, which is a cliche, but we'll just call it that. And when you're engaging in this rut busting and breaking habits, that was a medium change.
Yeah.
Is it always a medium change, or what are other strategies? Because I'm sure we all, as you've already indicated, we all go through those, and people oftentimes are like, how do I address this creative stasis or ennui? And so a medium change is one way you address it. Are there any others that you'd be willing to share, or maybe it's secret?
Yeah, no, it's not, because it's always different, right? So that was one, and it's following an impulse. It's following your intuition rather than like cutting it off and being like, well, I don't do that. I don't work that way. And the art world is ironically notorious for creating a lot of limits for artists, or implying that they should stay in their lane and do something to death. So I've done everything from put a timer out so that I'm not over, so my analyzer isn't super high. So that, because we're using a completely different language, it should be pretty low or off. So I've done timers and different, less precious materials. So I was more interested in just the expression versus I need to make a product because I have to sell it because I need to pay my studio bill.
Right.
So, and then just recently in this show, I have just been more trusting of these impulses. So I started particularly, this was the second one, but a piece where I put my initial thoughts down in paint really loosely, because I always fill up the space, right? Well, not always, but mostly. And it's like a layer down and then a layer
Pictorial
over.
space.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I liked the raw, rough thing that happened. It had its essence. The suggestion was there. I was like, this wasn't my plan. How do I actually finish it while keeping the integrity of what is screaming at me in this piece? And so I just thought about it for a while, and then I called a friend down from my building who always she works totally different wood cut printmaking. And she always has good insight, and we talked about materials, and I was like, well, I tried this and it didn't work, it soaked in, and then came up with, I bought some colored pencils, and it became like a drawing, which is not something I've been focused on for a long time, and it just was really rewarding. Like I have like the energetic experience of just like super trust in that kind of invisible energy of life was just like in sync, felt really good.
So preparing for this show specifically, this is the first time that the colored pencil works have been shown.
Mm-hmm.
And you've spoken a couple of times about doing things that are terrible or that you haven't been pleased with. And I wonder, I mean, and I think this is true of most artists, but it's a tremendous place of vulnerability, showing a fresh body of work, even when it's in a medium that you're very accustomed to manipulating and utilizing. And here you're mixing. Were you supremely confident in it? Was it just like, boom, yeah, I know this is right and this is the thing? Or was it not the case?
Well, while I was doing it, I was supremely confident, and I was excited, and then, 2 days before, I was like, is this just like terrible? Like, yeah, I went into the like analytical kind of external voice. What will it look like to somebody, and will it be harshly criticized? And then I realized, well, that doesn't really matter. Like, if I'm not the authority on my creativity, if I can't decide what feels good and have that be enough, then like that's not working. So then I came out on the other side.
You worked through it.
And I want to share that. Like, I love the idea of sharing that, because I think everybody goes through those open, free, internal spaces of confidence and feeling in sync. And then the minute, the thoughts about being in the world with it, we start to fall back into systems that we like believed were the ones we were supposed to have faith in. And it's good to know that like it's okay to bounce back and forth, but like ultimately you should be deciding what you think.
Yeah. And I mean, you answered my other question was, to what degree were you judging the previous work as failures? And it sounds like the schism or the division there was between being confident in yourself as the ultimate judge of the success or not of the work, and external judgment. Is that fair?
Right, like the drive, like early on in college, it's like, what kind of artist or painter are you? What are you? Like, it was like a stamp that I was a figurative narrative painter. So then it was like conceptualizing ideas first versus just the act of creativity, which is how really I would probably argue the majority of artists start, is that power of the act of creativity, not what are you going to make.
Sure.
And it's all worth it. I had to go through it, and I'm going to go through more stumbles, I'm sure. But right now I feel like I know how to get and recognize the place that's the best access to creativity.
Mm-hmm. Can you speak a little bit more about your, and I think I'm hearing it, but just elucidate on your process. Do you have there was a point that you mentioned something deviating, a work deviating from what you had intended. So there must be some original concept or idea of what you're shooting for to a degree. Is that true?
Yeah, I landed an aesthetic direction, and I would say that pretty confidently that landscapes and nature are going to be a dominant role in my work for a while. As far as how I come up with what I'm working with, sometimes it's just a photo I took as like sparks. I want to do that and I'm going to do it now.
Yeah.
And if I don't do it now, it might go away and I don't want to do it later. Sometimes I make collages because I just collect a lot of things that for no particular reason, whether it's a pattern, a piece of fabric, a photo, a drawing, that resonate with me, and I have bins of them. And if I have those moments where I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing, sometimes that's just the practice in itself, is just assembling things, because that's a really free space too, because no one is ever going to see them.
Yeah.
So there's no like any dominant like, it shouldn't go like that. It's just like, oh, that looks good. And then sometimes when I start something with whatever aid I'm using, it just goes totally in that direction. And it's like exactly how I saw it. Sometimes it's actually just an image I saw in my head. And then like I said, I just thought it was going to be a more painting. Like I've been using a lot of palette knives and more texture, and it was actually the opposite. And instead of fighting that, I just went with this other direction.
Sure. It sounds like the collage work is essentially, I mean, an analog would be a sketchbook, because it's for you, it's your research.
Yeah.
And do those collages ever turn out to be like 90% of a composition and then you just make changes, or are they mostly capturing a mood or a feeling that then you might riff off of in an entirely different way on a larger, complete work meant for public consumption? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Some are just like a super replicant of it. And some just create their own problems or challenges or turns where it's like, oh, that doesn't translate at all, but I like this piece. But sometimes the thing you're most attached to when there is like when the piece doesn't have that flow is the thing usually you got to take out. In my case.
Is that challenging?
Well, not as much anymore, because I kind of, I'm like, oh, it's that kind of metaphor for attachment. Like you think it's helping you, you think it's this strong piece holding things together, but really you're just attached to the idea of it. And maybe it was necessary to get you to that place, but it's okay to let it go. And that's the beauty of art, or really anything, is like, it can be super powerful, and I think the work vibrates and has the ability to give people peace, but it's also just materials on a surface. And so it's becomes a little easier all the time to just put something in the trash or change it totally.
How do you identify when a thing is a keeper or when it's done?
No, it's that you just know.
Have you always had that sense, or did you develop it?
I think I trust it now.
Okay.
Like some people will come to my studio, they'll be like, that's done, don't touch it. And I'm like, quiet, because I don't want to argue, but it's like, it's not done. I mean, I want it to be done.
Yeah.
So it's like nice to move on, but it's like, that's not done. No.
Materials-wise, medium acrylic paint seems to be foundational, but then there's the colored pencil work in this body. There's mica and other mixed media elements. How do you arrive at your material choice? What drives that?
I hate to be redundant, but it is just kind of it's like when I want to paint something and how big, because I paint little and giant. I mean, I'll sit with different wood pieces and be like, that's too big, that's too small, until just that feeling. And I think, I mean, I make conscious choices, right? So when I found that mica stuff, this is pretty magical, and it's like there's a natural component to it, and I am dealing with spiritual, energetic themes, so I just feel like that gives it a whole other reflective source. And then once I started doing it, it's fun to find other stuff, and it's just, one idea leads to another, and it's kind of balloons.
When you speak of this just knowing,
Yeah.
right? You have a feeling, and you trust, and you're better at trusting that feeling now. Is part of that trust that you feel like that feeling has been honed, or it has grown to a point where your intuition is correct more often than it was originally? Or were you born with that intuition and it's just a process of becoming comfortable with accepting it?
I like what you just said. It is a process. I think we all have it.
Mm-hmm.
We just kind of cave ourselves in with all sorts of ideologies and rules and...
Yeah. And maybe I should put it this way. Do you feel like everyone has that intuition, but
Yeah.
you do? And then it's finding how to trust it.
Yeah. I just think everybody does different stuff in their life to like have that. I referred in my statement to this idea of a peace break, where there's like a freedom from all the noise. It doesn't go away. It's just you're not adding anything. You're not trying to deny anything. You're just like in this like free space. So I think people find it in different ways. People find it in nature. They find it in like cooking, like elaborate meals that are like it's unnecessary, like beyond the function of like calories. People find it in prayer, in meditation, and that's why you can't absolutely saying one thing works for everyone is a little radical, because it's just, we all have a different frequency. Like things are gonna resonate with us different and bring us to that space differently. Like not everyone's gonna be a runner in their life, and it doesn't make running wrong or right. So I just have practices I've been lucky to find that now I can recognize it more. And I think it's just, I used to have this saying, like developing the habit of awareness, just that waking up. So I think I'm older and I practice a lot, and I just notice it more. So I try to incorporate things that'll allow me to be there. And then it's kind of universal. So now I can do it anytime, any old time. Conversations, driving.
That's magical. And I think a lot of artists would say that that's one of the most challenging aspects. But now you have it seemingly at will. You just said so, right?
It's available. I know that it's available to me. So then, but I'm a constant learner too.
Yeah.
Like I'm constantly reading more, listening more. There's just so many avenues to have information that's lovely to you come in.
For sure. But when you are in, and again, it's reductive, but we'll use the flow, quote unquote.
Yeah.
And when you're in that, are all other artistic challenges irrelevant, or do you still face challenge? What is your largest challenge working as an artist?
Well, there's still like the physical material world of like, I made a mark that needs to go away, and then that's just problem solving.
Yep.
I think this idea, anytime you go down a lane and you're like, this is what motivates me, it's like we separate like the dimensions of our being out, but they're really one thing. So it's like, you might be like infusing more in one avenue, but like if you're not really considering, it's like the external and the internal. If you're not like in balance, then it's not always a flow state. Like I have some work to do for a themed show, and I've been so free in how I work that well, it's like, what am I gonna make? And it started to feel like that old feeling of like, I mean, all that stuff is still there. It comes up. Like, what am I gonna make that speaks to that? And I just had to kind of relax a little. And I have a general direction now, but it's still kind of like, ugh, because there's a product that needs to be made with something in mind. And so that's going to be a new exploration of like, how can I keep open when there is a more definitive path ahead? And it's not just like, go be super free, or a potential commission coming in. Like, how do I keep that frequency when there is like an extra system on it?
And boxes you got to check. Yeah. Well, and you've hinted at what's next for you. So, can you tell us more? What is next?
I just have an invitational show, but really, what's next for me is I've had grand plans about creating the space that the work is housed in, like specific lighting, sound, so it's a multi-sensory experience. And, you know, we, as humans, we have these dreams and we wait. And waiting is like death to an idea, right? So I'm like, well, I do have a space, and I think of this on a grand scale, right? Like applying to the MAP gallery at the Institute of Arts. But I'm like, what if I did just one piece or three in my small space, and it, like, follow that idea just in a more intimate, approachable way, instead of waiting for some space where it becomes this big experiment that I don't know what's going to happen. Why not just do it now? So that will be my fall plan, and I hope to show something by like November.
How can people keep tabs and keep up and notified about your developments?
Well, honestly, the best way is social media right now. I do keep a website, and I'm trying to get into the flow of having it have more information other than just imagery. Instagram's the best. I use Facebook, Toni Gallo art. But I try to like be active on that.
Great. Any questions?
All right, so you talk about meditation and you talk about trust. I'm very into meditation, and I find it challenging to know when to trust my intuition. It's there, but sometimes I don't trust it. And so the first question, I've got a couple of them if other people don't have questions. The first one is, which came first, the meditation or the trust?
Meditation.
Okay.
So, as you know, in that world, a lot is called a practice. Like a yoga is called a practice. Meditation is a practice. And you always have a little faith that it's good for you to do it. And I don't like that word, but that you want to do it. Like that something expansive or more free will happen if you incorporate this into your life. And it resonates because there is stuff happening that pulls you back into that space. But I think with the trust, it's like you practice just feeling and knowing that's the trust, that it's beneficial to you. But there's these points where you remember analyzing it. I mean, how many times have I been like, am I learning a new thing or about energy and somebody guiding you and saying, you know, imagine this or that. It's like, well, am I doing it right? It's a thought like that where you realize those thoughts are going to come, but whatever you're doing is right. It's so abstract and elusive in a way. No one can tell you how you should be picturing it or if there should be a picture in it. And so it's kind of just allowing it all to be enough. The way that, say you go on a hike in a beautiful space, you're not like, gosh, those mountains are just really not in the right space.
I do that.
You know, you just don't question it. It's just, however it is, whether it's like a weedy sidewalk, like you just don't question nature. And however, it's just unburdening, whether it's right or wrong for me. I just land on things. I'm like, well, this could be wrong, but it feels like I'd rather this be my illusion than something else.
No, good.
And then
Thanks.
you see, like, everything starts to feel like it's natural instead of you needing to question whether it should or shouldn't. And then you just, yeah, then that kind of trust comes where you're like, my body is feeling it. My body is telling me. Other languages other than the voice in your head start to become stronger, for me.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
So my question is about how much of your process intertwines into like this other part of your life where you're not doing your painting? Like, do you find yourself in your other daily there's clearly like this flow that you're into in that moment that you're painting, and it's coming and it's creative, but to what degree does that kind of wind its way into your just regular daily life? And do you find yourself like thinking, this is this next thing I have to do, or this one thing that I'm working on? Does that?
Yeah, so, I mean, just as a normal human being, I get distracted, and if I'm not in the studio, I want to be, or, you know, if I'm there, I'm like, I have all these other things to do. That's normal. But a good example of how like it all integrates in my life is I remember a few years ago, I started cross-country skiing again. And so I would go skiing before I went to the studio. And I don't have a ton of time always because I've got 2 kids. And I remember being like, oh, this is so irresponsible. I should be getting work done. And then I was like, this is crazy. Skiing is making me more productive and better in the studio. I mean, it's like everything you read that resonates with you or that somebody says, or, you know, like you're like, oh yeah, like balance is key. And the more it's like, well, yeah, then if you really believe, like live that. And so stuff like that, where I started to question why I was questioning myself or making myself feel bad. It's like, I'm more curious, why am I doing that now than not? And so I realized I do need to do all these other things. Like painting doesn't have to be 10 hours straight in the studio. I'm probably more productive than I've ever been just because I know that. Got another one?
I can do this all day.
Clearly I can too.
Yeah, what time do we have? So you talk about you have the intuition and it just comes to you. One of the challenges that I know a lot of artists, myself included, have is that I trust that that thing is stupid and I need to get rid of it.
Yeah.
But now I have a hole. How do you fill that hole?
Well, I have troubled artwork, right? Like ones that are just, I have artwork that comes together in a week. And it's like, the voice says that was too easy. It must not be good enough. And then I have work that I don't know what to do with it. Like I know I want to do something with it. I know I want it to come to life, but it just doesn't have it yet. And I work on a lot at one time, so I just turn it around, and sometimes I turn it around for 2 years. And sometimes if it's really troubling my brain, I just get rid of it. But mostly, like, if I have the space to do it, and it just isn't happening, I just put it away.
I have a follow-up to Mark's, and then you can have it back, I swear. What is the longest period of time, if you can identify it, that you've turned something that wasn't working around and you came back to it and you were like, I know what that needs now? And maybe you can't say, I shouldn't give you an out. You have to say, you have to answer.
I mean, one was like 2 years. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was a hard painting anyway, but I was fighting more that it needed more. Mm-hmm. It needed more of what I had initially intended, and it didn't.
Mm-hmm. And there was a day that you came to the realization, this is it, and that's. And
yeah.
Are those, when you come to that resolution, is there a sense of greater accomplishment, or is it equal, lesser than? I'm just curious. Like,
I don't know if I can quantify that. I think it's just, it like goes back to that not being attached to what you thought it was going to be. So then you give it space for what it is, and then that feels good.
Totally.
Yeah.
I think Mark has a question.
I do, of course. You have a lot of pieces in the show, mm-hmm. and I can see similarities, but there's a lot of variety here. Mm-hmm. And the question that I have is, do you have some core vocabulary that you can look at in all of these different pieces and say, this is the language that I'm using, whether it's available to you in English or not? I mean, I can see that, but do you think in terms of having that vocabulary and applying it to diverse work?
I think it's all about creativity, and I think creativity is kind of infinite in its capacity. And I think it's easy to think if you're an artist that it's all gonna like end up being this one way, because that's kind of what we're taught in any field, is like, what's your specialty? And then because being an artist is so financially unstable, if you have even minor success, it is so easy to stay doing what you're doing and selling it to death because it worked and you need to pay for your groceries and your housing. And it's also reinforced in a lot of the like art world systems. I think it's changing, but I just actively am not doing that anymore. I just want to go with the ideas, because if I get to live this strange life where I get to be brave enough to make work, then I might as well just let it come in whatever form. And I will say, in the last few years, I read this book called Creativity by Matthew Fox. And it spoke to a lot of that. And it's really amazing what potential lies in creativity, even in creative thinking and communicating, if you just let it and don't over-identify yourself to begin with. But I'm just making at this point because it brings me joy.
Toni, thank you for sharing your work with us and our community.
Thank you so much.
We've been speaking with Toni Gallo about her exhibition, Continuous Thread, Unravelling Insight, on view now at Hopkins Center for the Arts through September 9th, 2023.